June 20th, 1944. Lieutenant Tom Brown had been aloft for 4 hours. His fuel needle was edging toward empty as his plane hummed through the night with only the black Pacific beneath. Then the sea detonated into brightness. Almost every vessel in Task Force 58 immediately abandoned blackout procedures. Searchlights stabbed into the sky. Deck lamps, running lights, signal lanterns, everything flared to life. Battleships hurled star shells that blossomed overhead in falling phosphorus. Enemy submarines still prowled these waters. One torpedo could consign 1,000 sailors to the deep, and yet they turned on every available light. Brayon saw the nearby Lexington's deck already crammed with planes. The landing signal officer waved him away. He tried to find another carrier, but his engine was already failing. If he didn't find somewhere to put down soon, he'd be in the water within moments. The clashes between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy in 1942 were titanic confrontations that altered naval combat. At Coral Sea, Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, aircraft carriers demonstrated they could decide engagements from hundreds of miles, rendering battleships increasingly obsolete. Japan paid a high price for those lessons. The ace pilots who once ruled the skies and terrified American newcomers were gone, lost beneath the Pacific or immolated in their cockpits, victims of Allied code-breaking and relentless tactics. Many of their carriers now lay corroding on the ocean floor, desperate to regain an edge. The Empire poured vast resources into rebuilding shattered air groups, training fresh pilots, and assembling new squadrons. Meanwhile, naval planners bided their time for an opportunity to turn the tables. In late spring 1944, that opportunity finally appeared. Victorious after sweeping through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, American island-hopping forces set their sights on Saipan and the Marianas, only about 1,200 nautical miles from Tokyo. Capturing those airfields would finally place the B-29 heavy bombers within reach of the Japanese home islands. In response, Admiral Toyoda ordered Vice Admiral Ozawa to launch Operation Eigo. Ozawa carried the nickname Gargoyle, supposedly because he was considered one of the least handsome admirals in the Imperial Navy. Behind his weathered, sun-darkened face, however, lay a keen tactical intellect. He now led a mobile fleet that assembled almost every operational warship available. His force bristled with weapons. 5 fleet carriers, including flagship Taiho, Junyo, and Hiyo, alongside Pearl Harbor veterans Shukaku and Zuikaku, were joined by 4 light carriers and their air groups. Screening this floating airfield were 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, and 22 destroyers. The raw figures were formidable. Ozawa had control of roughly 430 carrier planes, plus another 540 land-based fighters and bombers scattered across Pacific bases. He believed his nimble Zeros and torpedo bombers could strike from 100 miles beyond American reach. The plan called for the land-based aircraft to batter the U.S. fleet first, after which his carriers would finish off what remained. On paper, nearly 1,000 Japanese aircraft facing the approaching Americans looked overwhelming, but the numbers hid a fatal flaw. The veteran aviators who had terrorized Pearl Harbor and dominated the war's early months were gone. Their replacements came from compressed training programs, some with barely 100 hours in the cockpit. Ozawa knew these shortcomings, but pushed forward nonetheless. He understood the Americans were growing stronger. Operation Eigo would either rescue the Empire or confirm what the defeats of 1942 had already signaled, that Japan's era of dominance was over. Admiral Raymond Spruce had forged his career on cool, calculation, and steely reserve. While other admirals advanced on instinct, the 57-year-old moved with chess player precision, planning well ahead. He recognized that the Marianas invasion would lure Japanese carriers into the open, though many commanders would have pursued those. Carriers relentlessly, especially aggressive. Leaders like Bull Halley, who lived for the hunt, he chose to play a very different game. He kept his carriers, positioned close enough to protect Septons, Marines, and the supply vessels. If Ozawa wanted a fight, he would have to come and take it. On June 6, 1944, while Allied troops were storming Normandy across the globe, Vice Admiral Mitscher led Task Force 58 out of the Marshall Islands, Maruro Harbor. an invasion armada so massive that 5 hours passed before the last ship cleared port and set course for the Marianas. Mitscher's fleet fanned out across some 700 square miles of ocean, a floating battle group of nearly 100 warships. At its center sat 15 aircraft carriers housing over 900 aircraft, including the potent new F-6F Hellcat. Heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and dozens of destroyers screened the carriers, layering anti-aircraft fire and radar coverage. 7 battleships trailed behind, ready to unleash their big guns if the enemy closed. It was the most formidable carrier force ever assembled, disciplined, and built to break the Imperial Navy. As they steamed toward their objective, the Americans radiated confidence. When Life magazine's Noel Bush interviewed Admiral Mitscher, the commander said he expected to fight his way to Saipan and appeared satisfied by the prospect. While Japan struggled to replace its lost veterans with half-trained newcomers, the U.S. Navy rotated seasoned pilots back to the home front to train recruits and then returned those trainees to the fleet. That pipeline kept experienced airmen flowing into squadrons. Like their commander, the pilots shared a hunger for combat, telling Bush they'd prefer the Japanese show themselves rather than hide. They wanted battle, and battle was coming. But before the Marines could storm Saipan's beaches, Spruance knew the Americans had to control the skies to win. On June 11th, American carriers unleashed strikes on every Japanese airfield within reach. All day, Hellcats streaked low over Guam, Rota, Saipan, and Tinian, their 50-caliber guns walking tracers across ordered rows of parked planes. Behind the fighters came dive bombers, dropping 500-pound bombs into hangars, fuel depots, and control towers. Zeros scrambled to intercept. But these rushed trainees were no match for American veterans who outturned them, scored deflection shots, and sent enemy pilots tumbling into the jungle in lopsided dogfights. By June 12th, the island-based air power had been annihilated, and the shore squadrons Ozawa had hoped would salvage the situation for his fleet were gone. Yet 500 miles away, Ozawa studied charts aboard the flagship Taiho, checking how the land-based aircraft would sync with his carriers. Vice Admiral Kaka, commanding the battered ground forces, had not sent word of the disaster. On the 15th, as Marines came ashore on Saipan, Ozawa finally received the dispatch he'd been waiting for. Attack the Americans in the Marianas and destroy their carrier force. American submarines shadowing the Japanese as they departed port had sighted the fleet. Their coded reports reached Spruance within hours, confirming what he'd suspected. He gave the supply ships 2 additional days to finish unloading at Saipan, then ordered them to steam east as fast as possible to put distance between them and the approaching danger. His carriers, meanwhile, would hold position close enough to shield the invasion beaches. Spruance's plan was straightforward: make Ozawa come to him. Let the Japanese exhaust fuel and nerves crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean. Only if they drew near would he strike. But the Marines on Saipan took precedence above all. The battle now hinged on which side spotted the other first. For more than a day, the 2 admirals circled in the vastness, each waiting for that decisive sighting. June 18, 1944, almost passed without contact. Then, shortly before dusk, Japanese search planes finally located the American fleet. With night falling and unsure whether nearby airfields could support sustained operations, Ozawa chose to wait until morning. Moments later, American search planes also found the Japanese after intercepting a radio transmission that fixed Ozawa's position at roughly 355 miles west-southwest and closing. Task Force Commander Mark Mitscher saw his chance. If they reversed course and steamed west through the night at full speed, they could launch a dawn strike and catch the Japanese with planes still secured on deck. Spruce's answer stunned him. Permission denied. Task Force 58 would maintain its eastward station near Saipan. Spruance had already calculated the odds and believed Ozawa's pilots would attack at dawn, when his own squadrons were rested and defenses fully prepared. Through the night, American vessels slipped into a layered trap. Admiral Willis Lee's battleships formed the outer ring with their anti-aircraft batteries, while Spruance's carrier group spanned north to south in a defensive line. Any Japanese aviator who survived encounters with the fierce American fighters would still have to contend with Lee's battleships and the carrier's guns. Meanwhile, Ozawa's flyers planned to launch at first light, link up with the shore-based squadrons, and trap the Americans between two forces, still counting on some 500 planes that, in truth, no longer existed. Dawn would bring a brutal truth. At 8:30 a.m. on June 19th, Ozawa sent off his initial strike. 69 aircraft climbed from his carriers and turned east toward the U.S. battle line. American radar picked them up when they were roughly 150 miles out. By 10:23 a.m., hundreds of U.S. fighters were airborne, sprinting to intercept altitude. What followed was merciless. More than half the Japanese formations were cut down before they ever sighted an American ship. Only a few Imperial pilots pressed through. One dove at Lexington, only to be shredded in a crossfire from two cruisers whose combined anti-aircraft bursts simply tore the plane apart. Another managed to hit on the battleship South Dakota. Not one attacker reached the carrier deck. In 34 minutes, the opening wave had been finished. Of 69 Japanese aircraft, only 27 limped back. Returning pilots cheered on their carriers, trading tallies and whoops. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey overheard one man shout, "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot back home," and the phrase rippled ship to ship. Before long, everyone was calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. As Ozawa's second force of 128 planes roared off, pilot Sakio Komatsu spotted something through the morning haze that froze his blood, a torpedo wake cutting straight for Taiho's hull. In an instant, Komatsu reacted. He banked hard, pushed the stick forward, and dove his plane into the torpedo in a thunderous collision of fuel and metal. Sailors aboard Taiho celebrated their savior, but beneath the waves, the American submarine Albacore's periscope remained trained on the carrier. Komatsu had only delayed the threat by hours. The second wave fared little better. 19 planes were down before they reached the fleet, and within 30 minutes, 70 more had been shot from the sky. During the third and fourth attacks, many pilots either became disoriented or fled toward Guam's strips, only to find American fighters already waiting. By midday, it was done. Of Ozawa's roughly 374 aircraft, scarcely 100 returned. The rest lay in the Pacific or burned on Guam's runways. Against that slaughter, Spruce had lost just 22 planes and 60 men. Ozawa's humiliation continued. While surviving aircraft staggered home, American submarines cruised below like circling predators. Komatsu had given his life stopping Albacore's first torpedo. But the sub stayed in place, and a second torpedo soon struck Taiho's starboard side. Aviation fuel flooded damaged compartments, and damage control parties fought to pump the volatile liquid overboard before ignition. At 3:32 p.m., a spark met the fumes. The blast tore Taiho apart from within. Fuel roared through hangar spaces, the flight deck folded upward like paper, and massive breaches opened in her hull as the once proud carrier began to roll and founder. Ozawa fled to a destroyer, watching from its deck while some 1,500 of his men went down with the flagship. The submarine hunt did not end there. Commander Kyler in Kavala had trailed the carrier Shokaku since morning and fired 6 torpedoes. 4 struck home, ripping into the veteran carrier's hull and sending another 1,200 sailors to the deep. In a single morning, Spruce had broken Japanese naval aviation, and his pilots still hungered to finish the job. But Spruce held position until about 10 p.m. on June 19th, when he finally turned west to pursue the retreating Japanese. American search planes found nothing through the day until late the next afternoon, about 4 p.m., when Enterprise aircraft located Ozawa's force some 275 miles away, the extreme limit of American striking range. Mitscher faced an impossible decision. Launch immediately and his pilots would attack at dusk and then return through total darkness with near-empty tanks. His advisors warned he risked losing dozens of planes and crews. Mitscher finally gave the order he'd been waiting to give: launch every plane. Within 20 minutes, more than 200 aircraft screamed off the decks, each pilot painfully aware they would need every last drop of fuel just to reach the Japanese position. Then the news grew worse. An updated fix put Ozawa 60 miles farther away than the first report had indicated. Just as fuel gauges flirted with empty and hope began to slip, a pilot made out torpedo wakes cutting through the darkening sea. The Americans struck in successive waves, 216 aircraft plunging through the failing light. Ozawa watched in helplessness as his remaining 75 fighters were shredded within minutes. Every Japanese ship answered with defensive fire. Tracer streams stitched the dusk, but the attackers came on. Light carrier Hiyo took the worst of it. Bombs punched through her deck and detonated deep inside, and within minutes she capsized, dragging about 250 men down with her. Fleet carrier Zuikaku, a Pearl Harbor veteran, bucked under a series of detonations marching along her length. Junyo became an inferno, flames roaring from its hangar bays. Even light carrier Chiyoda suffered brutal hits while her gunners kept firing as she burned. 20 American planes fell through the flak, but their strikes had already delivered the knockout blows. As the last attacker vanished to the east, Ozawa surveyed the ruin. From roughly 430 planes at dawn, only a few dozen remained airborne. The American pilots now faced their own trial, finding their carriers at night with almost empty tanks. 2 hours of nocturnal flying lay ahead. Engines droned in tired ears and instruments blurred inside dark cockpits. Then the ditchings began. One Hellcat coughed and died, gliding into the Black Pacific. Minutes later, another ran dry. Soon dozens of fighters were going down. Mitscher, ever thinking of his airmen, had prepared a plan to help. He spread his task groups about 15 miles apart for broader coverage, then issued a decision that would define him. Every light on. Naval doctrine and training screamed otherwise. In hostile seas at night, you kept dark to deny submarines torpedo shots and avoid becoming an easy target. Yet his order went across the nets. Turn on everything. Across the dark Pacific, the impossible unfolded. Every ship in Task Force 58 blazed to life. Searchlights stabbed the sky. 5-inch guns fired star shells that burst overhead in white phosphorus. Running lights, deck lamps, even cabin portholes glowed. The fleet became a luminous beacon visible for miles, broadcasting its location to every submarine in the area. For 2 chaotic hours, Mitscher's audacity paid off. Returning pilots found the lit task groups and came streaming home, landing on whatever decks they could reach. Nearly half on the wrong ships, but alive. Some crashed while attempting landings after hours of combat. Others simply ran out of gas before reaching decks. Still, destroyers and cruisers raced to each splash, searchlights sweeping the water and hauling men from the sea. Those lights made the difference. Without them, hundreds would likely have been lost to the Black Pacific. Instead, rescue teams pulled 143 airmen from the water. By dawn, the scale of the miracle was clear. Of over 200 pilots who had attacked at dusk expecting not to return, most were aboard American ships. Losses were not negligible, roughly 80 aircraft lost and 50 airmen who did not come home. But Mitscher's bold illumination saved the remainder. That night, he again asked permission to pursue Ozawa through the darkness, but Spruance refused. Over the next 3 days, Spruance wound down operations. On June 21st, he sent Admiral Lee's battleships and cruisers west, hoping to catch the fleeing Japanese, but Ozawa had melted into the ocean's immensity. By June 23rd, with Saipan's invasion secure from surface attack, Spruance ordered the bulk of Task Force 58 back to Eniwetok for maintenance and refueling. And the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the so-called Marianas Turkey Shoot, was at an end. In the months that followed, debate flared over Spruance's measured tactics. In his report, Mitscher argued that the enemy had escaped. While badly mauled by a single aggressive carrier strike, the Japanese fleet had not been annihilated when within range. Many naval aviators agreed that Spruance had allowed Ozawa to slip away. But correspondent Null Bush, who watched Spruance's cool calculations unfold during the fight, saw it another way. In his view, the victory in the Philippine Sea was among the most complete of the Pacific War, writing that the Japanese fleet would likely never again emerge as a fighting force, and that its absence would give General MacArthur a free hand